I've been a political journalist for 15 years, and throughout that time I've closely followed the career of Gordon Brown. I've criticised and praised him, but one thing is undeniable. He's a massive figure of huge political gifts. And this weekend he's even been claiming that he's a humble, listening politician as well. And yet some senior figures on his own side believe he's unfit to hold the highest office. They've called him psychologically flawed, a control freak, and one has even said that he'd be an effing disaster as Prime Minister. This film, based on interviews with 100 witnesses, asks whether we should share these fears about Gordon Brown holding ultimate power.
His characteristics for me are he's a fantastic friend. He's a good friend in the sense that I can talk to him about anything, and I hope he could feel the same about me.
He is threatened by meeting or encountering people he doesn't know. It is very odd.
He is a very difficult man, and I would not like to be a cabinet minister in his government.
He's enormously well read. He's much brighter than Tony, but he's probably a worse control freak, and Gordon is also a terrible spinner.
Well, thank goodness it's only a game.
He loves conversation, he loves to talk about ideas. He's a really deeply cultured person.
If you're in the inner circle and you're loyal, that's great. You know, you're a friend of Gordon's. If he perceives you as in any way disloyal, then they're regarded as the enemy.
My colleagues from other member states used to say, what kind of relationship do you have with your finance minister? And I used to say, well, I have an excellent relationship with the Chancellor of the Exchequer, such that if I say good morning, Chancellor, about 1 in 10 times the Chancellor will reply.
Those comments are just tiny snatches from a 9-month study we've undertaken into Gordon Brown. Behind them lies a unique research base recorded in these detailed notes of conversations with people who've worked with or dealt with the Chancellor in a whole variety of ways. They include cabinet ministers, senior civil servants, MPs, economists, journalists and friends. Some of them will speak out publicly. Many others prefer to remain private, and it's especially difficult from those of Mr. Brown's own party.
A number of us are deeply troubled about the sort of premier he might make. Anything we say in public might be used during a general election campaign against the whole of the party. But how do you convince those who've not seen what Gordon is like sometimes that there might be problems?
Despite these widespread and strongly felt fears in his own party, Gordon Brown is now set to achieve power without a serious challenge in what amounts to a coronation. Tony Blair said that he would serve a full term. He hasn't. The wider British public has not only been misled, it's had no say in the matter at all. So what sort of Prime Minister are we going to get? The heart of the answer to that is a puzzle thrown up by our research, the contrast between the cold antipathy often perceived by colleagues and officials and the warm private man known to his closest friends.
We went to see him before he was married and had his own children, and my kids were quite young, they were about 5, 6 or 7 I think, slightly at a loss to know what to do, and he suddenly remembered that it stuck away in a cupboard somewhere was his old Scalextric set from the days when he and his brothers were kids. And no amount of persuading from us could say that it would be too much trouble. He got it out, got it all set up, found the transformer, changed the plug, put it all together, got an electric shock on the process, but it worked. And my son is absolutely, it's the one thing he remembers about Gordon. He's the man who's got the Scalextrics. Can we go back and visit, please? Because he was great.
Wilf Stevenson met Brown at Edinburgh, where, as a student, he was elected rector of the university. His meteoric rise was all the more remarkable as in his teens he'd had a serious accident playing rugby, which led to the loss of his left eye.
In the very early days, when I was first an MP, I went through the devastating experience where my 16-year-old suddenly lost the sight of an eye. And I happened to get into the lift in Millbank, and Gordon got in. And I didn't know him very well. But I knew that he too had lost the sight of one of his eyes. So I said, what do I do? How do I cope? What do I say to her? And he said, well, what's her name? So I gave him her name. And within 24 hours, he'd written a 3-page handwritten letter to her about how to respond to being blind in one eye.
It's clear that Gordon Brown can be a warm man capable of individual acts of great kindness. He's also a man of deep political drive.
He does have integrity, and he has a very, very strong conviction, which is part of his Scottish Presbyterian background, I think, of we must do something about poverty, not just in Britain's case, but in the world case, so hence his strong feeling about Africa.
He's a heavyweight politician. He's absolutely fascinated by policy, by the history of policy, by intellectual ideas. He thinks through what he does very carefully.
Even Gordon Brown's critics readily accept that he's a man of huge substance. The question mark is about his character and methods in power. The one concrete way to begin to explore what Brown might really be like at number 10 Downing Street is to examine what happened when he arrived at number 11 in 1997. His first act as Chancellor was the masterly decision to give the Bank of England independence to set interest rates through a Monetary Policy Committee, the MPC. Brown also stripped the bank's role as financial regulator, but oddly failed to inform its governor, Eddie George, in advance.
I think it was right that it was done. I thought it was done in a rather ungracious manner. It would have been nice to tell the governor first.
One very senior figure who was intimately involved in the transaction told us that the Chancellor's conduct was thoroughly bad manners. More importantly, it was the first and defining sign of how Gordon Brown was to operate in government. He chose to work through a very small and very secretive circle of trusted intimates and advisers. Senior civil servants have privately told us in great detail what they observed. Their accounts are read by actors.
It became clear that he would not deal with the Treasury as a whole. It was as if he became invisible.
He was really only prepared to work through a small circle of trusted advisers.
It goes much beyond having a circle that all-powerful politicians rely on. The circle is really very small. They were fiercely protective.
The members of Brown's inner circle at this time were the economic advisers Ed Balls and Ed Miliband, his personal assistant Sue Nye, his press secretary Charlie Whelan, and his first paymaster general Geoffrey Robinson, who'd funded Brown's private research office in opposition. Brown used this group ruthlessly to control access.
Had a very tight entourage around him, sort of trusted them, didn't really trust anyone else. People have to give absolute fealty to him, officials, I think, as well as the people who are politically close to him.
But the people that stood up to the Chancellor and argued a case were by and large not welcome, and a lot of them, right from the start, were moved on.
Officials never knew what he thought. I was told he never wrote on, when you do your red box, you write what your decision is. Never wrote on anything, so people had to go to Ed Balls to find out what the Chancellor was really thinking.
In the case of one very senior official, he took to standing in the corridor outside the Chancellor's office and waylaying one of the private secretaries and finding out the fate of submissions that had gone into the Chancellor, or how the Chancellor's mind was working.
Can you name him?
I wouldn't want to name him because I don't think it's fair.
But he was a very senior official.
Yes.
And he's left hanging in that gigantic echoing Treasury corridor outside the Chancellor's private office, on the off chance of meeting a private secretary who might just sort of
fill him in on what's in the Chancellor's mind.
The members of the inner circle defend Brown's modus operandi. Now, what about the accusation made by quite a lot of people, quite a lot of serious people about Gordon, that he's cliquey, that he is very hard to get to know, that he...
I'm not sure these are serious people in any
no, these are serious
meaningful...
people.
Well, I don't know who say that, but they probably don't know him very well. Every Prime Minister, every senior minister has got to have a group of trusted advisors. So it's no more than that with Gordon, absolutely no more than that.
However, the overwhelming majority of our witnesses do agree that the Brown Inner Circle has been unusually tight. Confirmation that little has changed came last summer, and pretty much from the horse's mouth. The Spectator magazine's political editor had written an article on New Labour rivalries.
A couple of days later, I got this furious email from a man who I shall only describe as a leading Brownite, certainly somebody with a very good claim to know the mind of the Chancellor, infuriated that I hadn't spoken to the right sort of Brownites. And to my amazement, he went on to list the 8 people, including himself, who know what Gordon Brown thinks. He put it this way, actually. The number of members of Brownite clan is large and growing, but those who have a claim to know Gordon Brown's mind, those who he speaks to, is very, very small.
Fraser Nelson then named the Brown Octet.
The guys in the octet were people who were either in the Treasury now or who had spent their career working for the Treasury and had become MPs. Ed Balls, for example, who is the intellectually at the pinnacle of the Brown operation. Ian Austin, Gordon Brown's former spin doctor, he was there too. Spencer Livermore, who's now Brown's current press officer. And Damien McBride, who's Gordon Brown's spin doctor, his Alistair Campbell figure, if you like.
Unless the Chancellor radically changes his methods, this coterie and 1 or 2 others will comprise the men and women who govern Britain. On the basis of the last 10 years, one most arresting observation can be made. Those included from his own age have tended to be lesser talents who run no risk of outshining him. The real ability within the inner circle belongs to the younger protégé who Gordon Brown can be certain will never challenge him. One startling example of Brown's apparent inability to embrace talented and independently minded figures of his own generation came after a Labour strategy meeting in the run-up to the 1997 general election.
We were discussing parts of New Deal, the programme that's been rolled out to help people move from benefit to work. And as I left the shadow cabinet room and was walking down the corridor, Gordon rushed up and got hold of me and yelled at me, "Why did you disagree with me? I thought you were my friend." And I replied, "Gordon, I disagreed with you because I'm your friend." And he looked aghast that those two positions could be held in common. And sort of coldness entered me, thinking, wowee, what sort of person have we got here? And and I think Gordon does divide the world between those who agree with him and are therefore his friends, and those who debate with him who clearly aren't.
Frank Field's story begins to explain why many senior Labour politicians have reservations about the prospect of Gordon Brown holding ultimate power. In Part 2, we'll explore how Brown's working methods and his personality have affected relationships with both political colleagues and civil servants behind the closed doors of government. And we'll see what that tells us about how he might conduct himself in Number 10 Downing Street. The most consistent message arising from our 9-month study of Gordon Brown concerns his difficulty in handling human relationships which stretch outside his inner circle, a difficulty which, as we'll see, has had an important effect on his behaviour in office. Even his friends acknowledge that there's a problem.
I think he's a sensitive man. I think at times he's maybe hypersensitive. I think he's loyal to his friends and generous to them. I think, however, that sometimes he maybe has a wee bit difficulty making friends.
One revealing illustration of this social awkwardness came, oddly enough, at an early moment of triumph when Gordon Brown attempted to organise a thank you for those who'd helped him win his first election onto Labour's national executive.
We sort of walked around Westminster. It was in the recess, so hardly anything was open, and we ended up in this little cafe outside the actual House of Commons, where Gordon, I remember, ordered us all spaghetti bolognese, and we sat there, and Gordon sort of smiled at us briefly, bent his head and started eating. He ate it all, one spoonful after the other, until it was finished, and then sort of said, well, thank you very much, it was great, OK, I've got to get back to the office. And it was a real eye-opener, which was that, you know, Gordon does really struggle with people that he doesn't know to make a sort of emotional connection. You know, now, we were on his side. We worked very hard for him, really, for little reward. And, of course, we sort of expected that there might be a bit of chit-chat.
But those closest to him say that despite the shyness and the gaucheness, Brown is a man who delights in discussion and debate.
Loves conversation, loves jokes, good laughter. He's the most open person to good ideas wherever they come from. I can't tell you how open he is. From this intellectual security he has, that he has a grasp of every issue, or if he doesn't have, he's prepared to engage.
But once again, the evidence from the inner circle is very different from much of what we heard in research interviews with more than 100 people who've dealt with Gordon Brown. Again and again we heard stories of how Brown snubbed, cut, bullied and ignored those around him. Colleagues and staff within Westminster and Whitehall bore the brunt, but this pattern of behaviour also surfaced in normal business negotiations.
He can't negotiate with people face to face. He doesn't have the capacity to say to people, we have a problem, we have a difference of opinion. How are we going to bridge this gap?
Gordon sets out his position. Usually that's not a position that is entirely accepted, otherwise there wouldn't be a meeting, would there? And so an attempt is made, by me, by others, to establish some discussion, some debate, some engagement. But surely, Gordon, won't this happen? I mean, you can't do that because it will have this result. So Gordon restates his position again. So sometimes he'll make a joke, and then he'll restate his position again.
Abroad, too, whereas Prime Minister Gordon Brown must develop good personal relations with foreign leaders, his style has been to transmit rather than receive. One incident, an EU argument about duty-free allowances, demonstrated a refusal even to acknowledge that others had a point of view.
And I think on that occasion, because Gordon Brown hammered away at something which the majority of the member states weren't prepared to agree to, he got himself into a certain amount of difficulty. And when he tried to sum up 3 times, as I recall, in the direction that he wanted rather than what the majority wanted, in the end, people were just sort of laughing because it had become, I thought, sort of embarrassing.
At one meeting of European finance ministers, Brown read his prepared statement, then took his headphones off and conspicuously worked on his papers. After the other ministers had read their statements, an official indicated to Brown it was his turn to respond. He put his headphones back on and simply reread the same opening statement. He would show the same contempt at 10 Downing Street.
At cabinet meetings and cabinet committees, he would sometimes bring his in-tray and do his correspondence. It was a male dominance ritual that demonstrated he was more important, as other cabinet members wouldn't dare to do it.
We had cabinet meetings, cabinet subcommittee meetings, and there was just opposition to indulge in discussion at the meetings. There was no conversation at all from Gordon's side. But secondly, there was another campaign run in private, which you were well aware of, that there would be an attempt to destroy people's reputations.
It's this double allegation of a refusal to collaborate with colleagues along with a vindictiveness against those who threaten to stand in his way, which is so disturbing. These character traits have mainly been hidden from public view, but they have manifested themselves in a series of feuds, particularly with potential challengers. Brown's first and most long-lasting feud was with his talented Scottish rival, Robin Cook.
I think that it went back to the time when a paper was produced on poverty in Scotland, an issue on which both of them were very concerned, and he felt that his contribution to this paper, which had been rather more substantial than Robin was prepared to give him credit for, in fact to the point that it was almost Robin Cook with the assistance of Gordon, and I think that from that there came a resentment.
So Gordon didn't talk to Robin for how long?
Well, I wouldn't say they wouldn't talk, but let's say they didn't talk unless they had to. Probably for about 10, 12 years, I would have thought, maybe a wee bit more than that.
Another feud is with Peter Mandelson, who has been shunned by Brown ever since he supported Tony Blair in the Labour leadership election of 1994.
Gordon was completely furious, felt betrayed, has never forgiven him, and will never forgive him, I don't think, and they barely spoke. He was terribly, terribly scarred by it, because he operates, Gordon, on the basis of having people with whom he thinks he has complete trust and loyalty. And there aren't many of them. You know, he's going to need more as Prime Minister, but there aren't many. And Peter was one of them. And it was that betrayal that upset Gordon.
Brown and Mandelson are still not talking even today, 13 years later. A third feud was with Mo Mowlam. That went far back to the years of opposition when Brown was shadow spokesman for trade and industry. Mowlam his number 2, with a mandate to woo the City of London.
She became very successful. She got very good publicity. The city loved her, and she just networked it brilliantly. And I think there was an element of jealousy from Gordon because he had a number 2 who was getting very good press. I think the other thing is he found her difficult because her approach to work was exactly the opposite of his, because she could wing it. I think Gordon found that deeply exasperating.
In government, the antagonism towards Mowlam continued. It was so bad that when Tony Blair offered her the job of Health Secretary, she declined it. What were the considerations that caused her to turn that down?
Her main consideration was Gordon. She knew that if she found herself in a spending department, that he would use all the power of the Treasury to wrong-foot her, to undermine her, and to destroy her. And she was just not prepared to put herself into that position.
The most significant of Brown's targets was the man who did become Health Secretary, Alan Milburn. Their apparent clash was over foundation hospitals, but senior Labour onlookers saw Brown's personal ambition at the root of it.
What clearly went badly wrong was when Gordon began to feel, and not without some justice, that Alan might be being pushed as the alternative to Gordon. So suddenly Gordon sees, young, bright, able guy coming up fast, and he'd already lost out to Tony. Was he really going to step aside for another person merging fast up the fast lane on the outside? No, that's the answer to that. So the clash, I think, was inevitable.
To Gordon Brown's friends, these vendettas are just part of everyday political life.
Nobody works perfectly with everybody, but I think the focusing of attention on some of the difficulties which arose or have arisen over the best part of 10 years perhaps ought to be put into perspective, of the fact it's 10 years. Very few chancellors, very few senior politicians have been in office that long and have had colleagues to coexist with for that long.
But Brown's treatment of his ministerial colleagues has amazed senior Whitehall figures.
Cabinet ministers are frightened, disapproving and respectful of him. He bullies ruthlessly, uses aggressive tactics. He is secretive, so colleagues feel under-consulted.
I have certainly seen him cut dead his colleagues. He'll just walk away from conversations if he isn't interested.
Before cabinet meetings, everyone would be milling around. He would be brooding on his own while others chatted. Sometimes someone would tiptoe over and would be swiped away by him. He was rude to Hewitt. He patronised her and tried to trample over her. He wouldn't say good morning if he was in the same room as Byers in a meeting. He never said hello to junior ministers.
Gordon Brown also dispensed this treatment to Tony Blair. It began almost as soon as Labour came to power, with Brown's spin doctor Charlie Whelan, the agent provocateur.
I got more and more frustrated that Charlie particularly was doing it in a fairly destructive way. And of course that provoked Tony Blair's supporters to come out of the woodwork. And you could see, and my permanent nightmare, because all my political years had been in a Labour Party that couldn't govern because it was divided, basically.
Clive Soley pleaded with Brown to stop Whelan's briefing.
And I went to see Gordon several times on that, and I didn't. That was one of the areas where I didn't get the response I wanted, actually, because I did want him to say, OK, I will see it stops. And, I didn't get told that.
Brown's conduct towards Blair only makes sense once one understands the bitterness and rage he felt about the outcome of the 1994 Labour leadership contest. This was shown by his reaction at the time to a survey of Scottish Labour MPs by the Scotsman newspaper.
We were surprised to find, although Gordon Brown came out top, there was a strong support for Tony Blair, much stronger than we ever anticipated. When we did that, Gordon Brown went ballistic. He phoned me. He was in a foul temper, and he unleashed this harangue for about 10 minutes. I couldn't get a word in. He said that I was acting on Blair's behalf. It wasn't true. He questioned the methodology, and he claimed that Peter Mandelson had put me up to it, which is just nonsense. I hardly get a word in the entire 10 minutes. It was just a complete harangue. And he claimed that this poll had cost him the leadership, which at the time I found completely over the top and astonishing, and still do.
Brown arrived at 11 Downing Street still believing he, not Blair, should be the man in number 10. Blair had given him unprecedented authority over economic and domestic policy. Brown interpreted this as a licence to defy number 10.
Brown and his team were very uncooperative. There were cabinet committees he was meant to chair, and he refused. Blair did not force him. No reasons were given for his refusal. He refused to answer letters that were sent to him or his team. Never before had I or the civil service experienced this refusal to cooperate.
Got down to absurdities that if you the Prime Minister perhaps would have an initial meeting with Gordon and myself and one or two other officials, it would go perfectly well. There'd be a decision that we must continue to have another discussion, and papers might be asked for, and nothing would happen. No papers would come over from the Treasury. It is just an extraordinary way, not just politics or government. It's in the private sector. I mean, you don't just make important decisions without having a thorough discussion on the basis of some written documentation. Now, the Chancellor would argue that he didn't want anything written down because it would only get leaked. Frankly, given the way that the Treasury's own team behaved, I mean, you can treat that with a pinch of salt.
Brown's attitude was not a recipe for smooth government. One small but extremely telling example concerned Gordon Brown's opposition to European plans to harmonise corporation tax. By now, Stephen Wall was at number 10 as head of the European desk, and he wrote to the Treasury to ask how Britain should handle the different position taken by the German government.
And I got no answer. And one or two Treasury officials came up to me and whispered in my ear, that was a very good letter, but of course we can't reply to it. And the reason they couldn't reply to it is because they weren't in a position to go back to Gordon Brown and get Gordon Brown to acknowledge that there was even a counter-argument. He had taken his view, and that was it. Under previous regimes, the Treasury would have responded saying, here are the arguments. Here are the arguments you need to deploy.
Of course, the Treasury officials who were talking to you, they may well have been open to the perception that they were being disloyal to the Chancellor.
Yes, although, I mean, disloyalty didn't come into it. There was no question of Treasury officials saying, well, Gordon wants this, but we want the other. It was just a question of trying to, my job was to understand what the Chancellor and the Treasury wanted, and then to try and work out with them and others how best to achieve a negotiating result for Britain.
It's hard to quantify how much Brown's lack of communication was caused by a genuine difficulty in dealing with people, and how much it was a naked display of power. Either way, it spread throughout Whitehall.
He cannot deal with people. He cannot deal with conflict with people. The only way he knows how to deal with people is to either get somebody else to do it for him or to present them with a fait accompli. And so the way he deals with ministers, typically in the course of public expenditure rounds, is by bouncing them.
One of the perennial trials for Whitehall is knowing things are being cooked up in a back room without your knowledge. No competent business manager would do this.
Whitehall secrecy means that very few specific examples emerge, but one senior civil servant, the former permanent secretary at MAF, the Ministry of Agriculture, told us of his astonishment at the lack of consultation.
The 1998 settlement, spending settlement, called a Fundamental Expenditure Review, as regards MAF, had not been discussed with MAF at any level, including ministerial level.
It's very striking that you take part in a process in which neither the voice of civil servants nor even the voice of the minister is heard at all.
Yes, I thought it was odd.
Had you come across that practice under any previous government to 1997?
No.
Some ministers developed specific techniques for getting through to Brown.
You have to make an effective case, and you have to give Gordon credit. And provided you were prepared to let him make the big announcement, to do the surprise to the public that this is something that we're about to do, then it was possible to get Gordon on side, to have a real ally, and to get a policy pushed through. And that's what we did with free museums. Huge success.
The government's policy is for free museums, and I can announce we will change the law on VAT to make that possible. The Secretary of State for Culture will set out the full details of this change.
I'd much rather have the policy in place. I'd much rather have the change made, even if it means that he gets the initial glory. Absolutely fine by me.
He liked always to write articles for the press with you, but I would only do it if it said what I thought. I mean, we were the department. We were the ones doing all the analysis and thinking. We knew what we were doing. So to have, I mean, he set up a team in the Treasury, sort of resembling us, and used to have breakfast with all the faith groups to talk about development. It was trying to get the creds. But I didn't mind any of that, and I was happy to go along with that and let him get creds. But my quid pro quo was, you've got to stick with the policies we're doing.
Gordon Brown loves making announcements, but if something goes wrong, you tend not to see him for dust. For example, he was happy to announce his flagship policy of working family tax credits, which refund money through the tax system to encourage people to work.
Now, we have concluded that to help people move from benefits to wages, nothing less than a comprehensive tax and benefit reform and the modernisation of the welfare state is now required.
The system was fully introduced in 2003, but it was a shambles.
I don't myself think that there was anything fundamentally flawed in policy terms with tax credits. What went wrong was quite simply the computer systems. And it's an unfortunate fact, computer systems do go wrong in both the public and the private sector. What was disastrous, and I don't mince that word, was that The system was fundamentally flawed for such a high profile and such an important process.
It's very interesting to learn from you how the Chancellor then reacted.
Now, I didn't actually see the Chancellor during the worst of that period.
Nor did anyone else.
I absolutely acknowledge and have done as the Minister, both on the introduction of the tax credits.
It's Gordon Brown's Treasury Minister, Dawn Primarolo, who time and again has come to the House of Commons to take the flak over tax credits. Indeed, the former Permanent Secretary at the Treasury, Lord Turnbull, has said Brown has a McCavity quality, is not there when there's dirty work to be done. These numerous and authoritative accounts of Gordon Brown's behaviour in office, his sulks, his surliness, his refusal to cooperate. According to one well-placed insider, he even stormed into number 10 Downing Street to hurl obscenities at Tony Blair. Paint a very different picture to the warm man loved by his friends. There is a discourtesy there. How do you reconcile this with these charming, the person that you know?
Well, I can't comment on the former because it's not a character I've ever seen. He's always been the most courteous person in the room whenever I've had the pleasure of seeing him in business. But I think, at the end of the day, people are who they are, and that will come out. He may have had reasons for wanting to push forward a particular point of view, and that may have bruised some egos. Presumably he'll be sorry about that, and I'm sure he would say again what he has already said on the record, that sometimes in politics you do lose friends, and that's a problem. But if the ends are important enough, then it's much more important to make sure the policies work and we get things done.
The man has been Shadow Chancellor for 5 years, Chancellor for 10. Who comes out of that job intact emotionally, intact intellectually, but most importantly of all, intact from the point of view of his professional reputation? It's a pretty, by any standards, significant achievement, and he's done that. But he hasn't appeared as the most attractive person on top seems to be scarcely surprising, and not the best indicator of how he might appear once he's Prime Minister.
But is that right? Will Gordon Brown change in number 10? In part 3, we examine a charge made by one senior colleague which lies at the heart of any serious analysis of his fitness to be Prime Minister, that he's a control freak. This March, Gordon Brown used his final budget to make a sensational exit as Chancellor.
I will from next April cut the basic rate of income tax from 22 pence to 20 pence.
This surprise announcement of a 2p cut in income tax made it seem like a tax-cutting budget.
It is the lowest basic rate. It is the lowest basic rate for 75 years. And I commend this budget to the House.
But economists quickly pointed out that what he gave with one hand, he took back with the other. Our body of research includes a range of interviews with independent economists. They agree that the Chancellor will use almost any device, including a degree of obliqueness, in order to present statistics in the best possible light. They also agree that he's been lucky with the global economy. But there's a genuine acceptance that he's presided over buoyant times with year-on-year growth, stable inflation and stable interest rates. The irony of Brown's final tax cut flourish is that it masks what is by far his most significant legacy. He has in fact introduced a range of new taxes and raised existing ones to enable him to hugely increase the proportion of national income spent by the state.
Between 2001 and today, he had an increase in public spending as a share of GDP by almost 8 percentage points. That's a massive increase, unparalleled over that period in the industrial country, anywhere in the world. And he is not ashamed to push for big government, and he believes that a big government is the solution.
For Gordon Brown, big government comes from the Treasury, and he has radically expanded its power to make policy and impose it on other ministers and departments. This has given rise to one of the most significant charges against him. Last autumn, the former Home Secretary Charles Clarke labelled Gordon Brown a control freak. This comment met with recognition amongst many who had observed the Chancellor's methods. It's the combination of control, along with the refusal to communicate beyond a tight inner circle, which has caused the gravest concern amongst those civil servants who've had to deal with Gordon Brown's treasury.
It was very difficult to have a really open discussion about very sensitive issues, partly because the officials themselves didn't necessarily know the Chancellor's mind, and if they didn't know the Chancellor's mind, then they didn't know the policy, because none of his junior ministers had any authority, really, except as implementers of policy. And people were nervous about chancing their arm, therefore, on policy. So that made the coordination of government business much harder.
Madam Speaker, we have made our choice. Improved investment in health, education, transport, social services and in our communities. It is now for those...
One former Labour cabinet minister says that this way of working has severely hampered the effectiveness of Brown's massive increase in public spending since 2000.
Gordon always knew he was coming in year 3 with the big spend. But he didn't tell people to prepare. And then he came in with all the wretched, ridiculous bureaucratic targets, which have been very destructive for public sector reform, and the public sector has been drowning in the bureaucracy that went with the money. And that was all Gordon, and it was not good policy, and it meant the money was less effective than it might have been. So that's bad control freakery and centralisation and not trusting anyone.
Can he let go enough to allow people, other cabinet ministers, to run their own departments, not be meddled with, not be micromanaged?
Well, micromanagement's another misconcept. These things get aired in the press, and then lazy journalists, unlike yourself, latch onto them and use them. It doesn't bear any relationship to reality. The Treasury certainly took an interest in policy in a way it hadn't done before, but it's only to get the agenda right, to set the agenda. Look what happened in the money that was found for health. Do you think the Treasury micromanaged that? I only wish they had. We wouldn't have given, at the macro level, so much away with, who knows yet. I'm sure the benefits will come through. They will come through. But you can't say that that was micromanaged in any way.
Whether or not micromanagement is the right word, there is a clear consensus among senior civil servants and political colleagues that, to Brown, control, enforced by the tight inner circle, is all important. And there is a further consensus that a Prime Minister would have real problems working like this.
I mean, Chancellor of the Exchequer has been, as we all know, the most powerful job in the government, but he has to focus on a relatively small range of issues at any one time. I think it's harder for a Prime Minister to operate in that way for self-evident reasons, because the Prime Minister is having to focus on a much wider range of issues and will be, again, on the whole, unlike a Chancellor, will be faced 3 or 4 times a day with issues over which he has no control, things that are happening out there in the world to which he has to respond. And then you do need to be able to have confidence in more than just the immediate people around you, because if you're going to do the business, you've got to have a team who know. I mean, if you're a senior official, you can only operate successfully if you have the trust of the guy you work for and if you know their mind.
Even Brown's admirers within Whitehall acknowledge his huge difficulty in trusting anyone outside the small inner circle. Can he get over this? This weekend and before, he does seem to have been saying that he now wants to give away power to others.
I would see the state as the servant state. I would see the government as serving the people. I would see the service, if you like, emphasis of government is incredibly important, that you've got to listen and then you've got to be prepared to talk, consult, debate, and I think that is the way...
This is a change of style for you, isn't it?
I don't think it's a change of style for me, but I think the issue is the challenges of the future demand something quite different from the past.
Yet there are the counter-indications that Gordon Brown still needs to keep control with his tight circle. And many in the Labour Party, beyond the one or two prepared to speak publicly, are concerned as to whether he is the man to lead its next phase of government.
I mean, the shocking experience of you can't be my friend because you disagreed with me raises really big questions about where New Labour Mark II goes. We've now spent the money, and there is no new tranches of taxpayers' money to spend, which means that the premium is on intellectual ability to understand what's wrong and what we might do about it. And I've not seen those qualities of self-criticism and encouraging others in a friendly fashion to criticise policies as opposed to personalities, which would suggest to me that we have a certain election winner in Gordon becoming leader.
We invited Gordon Brown to take part in this programme. His office said that he was unable to, as he was too busy. As Brown stands on the threshold of 10 Downing Street, a fascinating prospect awaits. For the Labour Party is about to crown a new Prime Minister in the hope that his future conduct will not reflect his past.
Since 1994, when you can argue about the history of it, but he believes he was stabbed in the back, he has kept a very close circle of political associates, right? He has believed effectively that he's sort of in a bunker, right? That out there you have not just the Blairites, but, you know, the Tories, the media, and all these other people who want to try and attack him. Now, I think that the key for Brown is that once he actually becomes leader of the Labour Party, if that happens, and Prime Minister, then a shift will take place in his mind, and he will realise that actually now that's the moment where he can actually broaden that circle. You know, he can bring in people because they're no longer a threat. They're no longer, he's no longer at war, effectively, with Tony Blair. That's history.
The big tantalising question is, assuming he's going to be the Prime Minister, will power make him bigger? Because sometimes it does. People relax a bit and become a bit bigger. Or will he go on as sort of control freak, Gordon who won't trust anyone and can't allow systems to work and to be properly advised? I don't know which it'll be.
You don't know which? What would you guess? I mean, what would your intuition tell you?
I really hope that big Gordon comes through, the country could do with it, and it'd be good for him. I fear the control freak is very deeply entrenched.
Gordon Brown will be Prime Minister within a matter of weeks, and it's so important from the point of view of the whole country that he succeeds. But we are taking a leap into the dark. He's a brilliant man, capable of great decency and great warmth, but he's also dark, brooding, closed, clannish, very difficult to deal with. The success of the entire Brown premiership depends on whether, from the moment that he attains his lifelong ambition and enters Downing Street, he can become a changed character.